Good evening, everyone. It's really great to see you. On behalf of the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation, we welcome all of you to this evening's exciting program featuring Charles Stick. There was such an overwhelming response, and we have indeed filled the room. My name is Jennifer McGregor, and I'm the new executive director of the foundation. We're so thrilled to have you here, and we were really excited when Tom brought this idea forward not so long ago, actually, and that we were able to make this happen in a pretty quick turnaround. Incredibly, tonight is also a manifestation of another element that unites us in our profound, unique community. As I look around the room at landscape architects, building architects, graphic designers, photographers, interior designers, neighbors, friends, and homeowners, there's so much that unites us, and that's actually the beauty and the rich history of our town. We welcome you to join us through membership and support of the Preservation Foundation with our sole mission of protecting the historic visual character of Lake Forest. You'll find information on the table about membership and also on our amazing website. We do have intriguing programming throughout the year, and we also have a lot of fun along the way. Tonight, we'll enjoy the presentation followed by a Q&A led by our Tom Gleason. And then we'd like to invite you all to stay for a reception of wine and hors d'oeuvres and also some more book signing. Thank you to the Bryan family for your generosity in making tonight's event happen. Charles Stick is a native of Western Springs, Illinois, and has been practicing landscape architecture for 35 years. Charles is based in Charlottesville, Virginia, and now made his return to Chicago area 31 years ago while working on landscape projects and gardens with John Bryan at Crabtree Farm. This partnership still continues today with the Bryan family. Charles designs residential gardens across the United States, drawing on the principles of Palladio, Charles, Platt and Russell Page to connect the architecture and the land and develop enticing pathways between the formal planting and the landscape beyond. The lecture tonight celebrates his recently published book by Monticelli Press. The book profiles his incredible career and clients in landscape architecture. Please join me in welcoming Charles Stick.
Good evening. It's such a wonderful treat for me to be here this evening, to look out and see so many familiar faces. Your collective presence has made me feel very welcome, and I'm very grateful for this kind invitation. I'd like to thank Tom Gleason and his friends at the Lake Forest Preservation Foundation for this wonderful event this evening, and it is certainly true that it would not have taken place without Tom's kindness and generosity and hard work. Thank you, Tom. Finally, I'd like to thank Neville Bryan, her family, and my friends at Crabtree Farm. In fact, I have Neville Bryan and John Bryan to thank for much of the good fortune and joy that I have known in this life over the past 31 years. It is obvious to anyone who knows me at all that this is not an exaggeration. I should not be here tonight if it were not for their love and generosity. I must begin this evening with a simple disclaimer. I did not write this book. As you will plainly see, words are not my thing. Jeff Poole could not be here tonight, and I can assure you this evening would have been much more entertaining had he been able to join us. It's often said that good gardens are made of pathways and places, and I'd have to add the last word to that, pathways, places, and people. This evening I shall touch upon the pathways, places, and people that have defined my life as a landscape architect. Those of you who know me intimately know that I possess a strange, unwarranted, and unfortunate disregard for young people. My involvement in this book has shown me the light. For some strange reason that I cannot explain, perhaps an ever-increasing sense of my own mortality, I chose to embark on this book project with Jeff Poole as an appreciation or a simple suggestion that a life in the garden, in whatever capacity, is a life well spent. My greatest wish is that Jeff's book will serve as an inspiration to a young woman or man who may be tempted to walk along this path and open that garden gate. Pathways, places, and people. As a young person growing up in the suburbs of Chicago, there were customary signs of a misspent youth. I can assure you that there were no outward indications of a life of artistic or creative sensitivity, none whatsoever. I simply did two things very well. I had a very, very good slap shot, and I skated very fast. My athletic prowess allowed me to attend Middlebury College, a school that would most likely have been out of my reach had I not been a good athlete. As I look back at this photograph of the Middlebury campus from many years on, I'm taken by the notion that my decision to attend college in Vermont was the first time in my life that an appreciation for what was aesthetically pleasing would be the determining factor in my decision-making process. Middlebury was and still is a very beautiful place. I now understand that this great attraction was a deep-seated love of places that represent a perfect union of the natural environment and man's mark on the land. At Middlebury, I was one of a total of 1,200 students. Most of my classes were attended by 12 or 15. My distaste for the culture of collegiate athletics grew rapidly, and within a year and a half, my athletic career was over. As I look back on it now, I realize how skillfully but inadvertently I had worked the system. An introductory course in the then new theory of plate tectonics captured my imagination. I found myself enraptured by the study of geology. More importantly, I was surrounded by professors who, through their own love of the field and the natural world, taught me how to learn. I was taken under wing by Professor Brewster Baldwin, who was the first person who taught me how to look and listen to the stories that the natural world has to tell. Middlebury was one of the only small colleges in the nation at the time that possessed an electron microscope, which allowed the smarter students to analyze rocks and minerals in thin section. I found this absolutely daunting. Instead, I gravitated to the study of geomorphology, a much more tangible division within the field, which concentrated on the natural processes and the formation of landforms. In my experience, this provided me with richer and more accessible opportunities to unlock and understand the stories that nature has to tell. A year after I graduated from college, after writing my thesis entitled "The Glacial Sedimentation of the Champlain Valley," luckily for you, we're not going into that tonight. It was required of all geology students to pass a course in chemistry, a course in physics, a course in calculus. And I stand here before you tonight to admit that if that had been the case when I was in college, I'd still be at Middlebury College. Late in my third year in college, unbeknownst to me, my pathway was about to turn. I had been invited by a young woman and classmate of mine to attend a lecture by a man who had come to discuss the redesign of the Middlebury campus. The subject was in no way high on my list, but because I was so enamored by the young woman who invited me, I insisted on accompanying her. I remember clearly walking into the lecture hall and seeing this rather elfin character with his silver hair smatched up under his round glasses. With great passion, he described how he was going to bury the main street that ran through campus so that we could all pursue our studies in a joyful and unencumbered manner. He described moving through the landscape as a physical experience, not unlike the act of skiing down the slope of nearby Killington, gliding between the moguls. He made comparisons to the planting of trees in an ordered manner, to the structures and rhythms of classical music, all in the hand of man. For some strange reason that I still have a difficult time articulating, the light had come through the window, and I decided I should become a landscape architect. Dan Kiley, although I did not realize it that afternoon during his lecture, was considered the greatest landscape architect of our time. He had collaborated with Eero Saarinen, I.M. Pei, and Philip Johnson. His practice, anchored in Charlotte, Vermont, focused on a great array of corporate, private commissions, far-reaching in the world. He was once referred to as the great classicist of our time, mostly due to his love of the 17th century French gardens of André Lenotre. Dan's way of structuring the built landscape resonated with me right from the start. He spoke a language that I wanted to learn. Weeks after my first encounter with Dan, I drove up Route 7 to visit him in his office in Charlotte. His advice was simple: if this is a chosen path, then you must go to graduate school, and the University of Virginia might be a good place to start. This Yankee was headed south to Charlottesville. This is a photo of Dan Kiley as he accepted the Jefferson Medal of Architecture at the University of Virginia. He's standing next to an unidentified graduate student. Virginia has been and still is a very good place for me. Once again, during graduate school, I was surrounded by people, both my professors and fellow students, who were passionate about their work. I was taught to see, mostly through learning to draw and sketching by hand. There was an old saying that suggested when one hired a UVA graduate, you knew who you were going to get, a person well-versed in the classical vocabulary. One visit to Jefferson's lawn and the clear articulation of his architectural vision for the new republic was enough to realize that one was at the epicenter of classical America, a vocabulary and language that has always been the foundation of my practice as a landscape architect. I remember one day Dan coming into the office. I was very fortunate to work for him after I'd been in graduate school, and Dan came into the office one day, and he said to me, he was talking about the process of design, and he said, "Charles, I'll tell you what, if you ever design anything in the landscape that is somehow accidentally or serendipitously beautiful, you must always take credit for it." Meade Palmer was one of the most influential characters of my life at the University of Virginia. His small office was located in Warrenton, Virginia, where he designed landscapes on both the commercial and residential scale, with an emphasis on the latter. Meade was a Virginia country gentleman and a sportsman. In his seersucker suit, pipe clenched firmly in his mouth, well into his 70s, his 15 graduate students would do their best to keep up with him as he made his way through the UVA campus, teaching us about the plants that adorned this beautiful place, all plants that he loved and knew so well. Meade's small practice and personal involvement in each of the projects he took on became a template for the professional life I envisioned for myself. All of a sudden, it became clear to me that it was indeed possible to make a living by telling people where and how to plant their trees and shrubs, and that most importantly, this could result in a meaningful and joyful professional life. One of my favorite stories that Meade told me one day was when he was describing a commission that he had taken on in Northern Virginia for for Mr. Mellon, who was he was helping Mr. Mellon design the entry drive to his place up in the Middleburg area. And Meade went about his business and said, Mr. Mellon, listen, I have secured us 150 of these wonderful maple trees that we're going to plant along the driveway on both sides. And they're 3-inch caliper maple trees, and I can tell you, Mr. Mellon, it's just going to be paradise when we're done. Mr. Mellon turned to Meade and said, Meade, I'll tell you what, by the time those trees grow up to be anything, I'm going to be in paradise. You better get yourself some bigger trees. Soon after completion of my master's degree, I was offered a position by the Belgian landscape designer François Goffinet, who maintained an office in London and was about to set up a practice in Charlottesville due to several large projects that had recently come his way in the United States. Goffinet had positioned himself as the heir apparent to the great British garden designer Russell Page. Page was a consummate artist, a painter before he came to the world of garden making, with a vast knowledge of ornamental horticulture and an unwavering eye for composition. Page created some of the most beautiful gardens of the 20th century, both in the United States and in Europe. His book, The Education of a Gardener, is a masterpiece of garden writing that must be read and reread by anyone who is interested in the world of gardens. Page died in 1985, before he could complete one of his greatest works, the Donald M. Kendall Sculpture Garden at the PepsiCo World Headquarters in Purchase, New York. The master plan had been completed. The positioning of most of the sculpture had been completed. However, major portions of the planting that supported the experience of this great work still required oversight and implementation. François Goffinet was hired to see to it that Page's master plan would be executed as faithfully as possible to the original plans. After several years in the Goffinet office, I was asked to help manage the further development of the garden. This was an extraordinary opportunity for a young landscape architect. And even though I never had a chance to know Russell Page, I feel as though working in his footsteps at PepsiCo will always be one of the great benchmarks in my understanding of what goes into making joyful, well-considered landscapes. Page's architectural framing and attention to the interplay of the energy exchanges between animate and inanimate objects have been lasting lessons for me. This is a photo of Page's Culpeper Garden at Leeds Castle in Kent. This was the first Russell Page garden that I had ever experienced as I woke up in the groom's cottage on my first trip to England. And now several pictures of Page's garden at the PepsiCo headquarters in Purchase. Well, now it's the time in my talk when I ask all of you to suspend belief. You must pretend that I'm not reading the following, but I must because it's what I consider the best part of this book. It's Jeff Poole's afterword. In my opinion, it captures the essence of this simple story. And I quote Jeff, "It shouldn't be remarkable, and yet there is undeniable joy in witnessing the basic function of nature, dazzling green shoots emerging from dried husks buried in the ground, and knowing that you played a small part in creating something so simple, complex, and beautiful. Gardens are the manifestation of our individual relationships with the natural world. They are pragmatic plots, plants and places, outcomes-based, transactional operations. They are peaceful sanctuaries, public or private escapes for personal contemplation and restoration. They are delightful diversions, happy messes of trial and error, heavier on the heart than horticulture. Each represents our own attempt to connect with nature and find some measure of joy in that bond." I've never been fond of actors or artists in discussion of their own work. I find it undeniably self-aggrandizing. I'm reminded of something that the great singer Joni Mitchell said in a concert in 1974. She was trying to describe her understanding of the difference between being a singer, a songwriter, and being a painter. And she went on. It's the one thing that's always been the major difference between the performing arts to me and being a painter. You know, a painter does a painting when he does a painting. And that's it, you know. He's had the joy of creating it, and he hangs it on a wall, and somebody buys it. Somebody buys it again, or maybe nobody buys it. And it sits up in a loft somewhere until he dies. But he's never, you know, nobody ever says to him, you know, no one ever said to Van Gogh, hey man, paint a Starry Night again. He painted it, and that was it. However reticent I might be to carry on about the work I've been involved in over the past 30 years, I'm now going to beg your indulgence as I ask you to join me on a walk through 5 of the gardens that have shaped my life and brought me endless joy and satisfaction. For so many of you in the audience, Crabtree Farm does not need an introduction. I was asked in 1991 to come to Lake Bluff for the first time to meet Neville and John Bryan. The Bryans, their wonderful David Adler house from 1927, were hoping to, at the time, renovate Ellen Biddle Shipman's rose garden at the base of the main house. At the same time, we were going to think about putting a new road into the property from Sheridan Road. We redid the Ellen Shipman garden and simplified it tremendously, and actually turned it into a rose garden. This is a plan of Crabtree Farm. I would have to say to you that I consider Crabtree Farm, I label it in my own way, a Georgian Arcadia. It is a garden that is made of pathways and places. Those places are defined by buildings and pieces of sculpture. They are the story that has been told by John and Neville Bryan for many years now. I think of the house at Crabtree Farm, and I wonder what William McCormick Blair would think of it almost 100 years later. And the thing that is so special to me about this beautiful place is that it represents the essence of the country house world, and the fact that in so few examples across the country, the true heart of the country house mentality has left and disappeared. And those of you in the preservation world understand that so clearly that, of course, the great estates in the North Shore, so many of them have been split up, and 4 families live in the property that one family used to live in. And the most extraordinary thing about Crabtree Farm that was so evident to me right from the start was that indeed Adler's plan and vision was all still intact. This plan shows a little bit of the organization of the garden and the landscape in general, in terms of the radiating pathways. On the right-hand side is Lake Michigan, the main house, the rectangular form that you see in the top of the screen. Oh, there we go, Tom. I'm going to be in trouble. There, back again. You can see that in some ways this plan has an outline that almost looks like an outline of a Baroque French garden, with the pathways going from rond-point to rond-point. And it just so happens that those pathways are the are the thread that ties the entire landscape back to the various buildings that you find throughout this woodland. Here's another photograph of the front garden, of the main house. About my time at Crabtree Farm, in that it has been the word benchmark is not strong enough, or not with enough weight to describe the feeling that I have for this place. Jeff Poole, I think, put it very well in the book when he described the feelings that I have in terms of my relationship with John Bryan. As Jeff writes, John Bryan was, without exception, the greatest influence on my life. He was my mentor and a father figure to me. He lived a purposeful life, one that was lived graciously, sensitively, beautifully, and fully, all in consideration of those around him. I miss him each day. The other thing that's so special about Crabtree Farm is the buildings that occupy this landscape are all the result of a passion for collecting and a passion for the integration of landscape and architecture and decorative arts, and how those things inform one another, and how those things add up to a garden composition, a landscape composition, an architectural composition that is an integrated whole. And it's a way of looking at the world that I think we seldom come across these days. There's old Atlas in his niche with a view to the lake, just a snippet of the view to the lake. There's a wonderful place, a wonderful part of the property at Crabtree where you stand back at the Jefferson Pavilion, which you'll see in a moment, and you look back towards the main house. And right through the center of the main house, you see the lake shimmering through the door. And I've always thought about the fact that David Adler was a rather short fellow. And I know that Adler stood in the place where I just described, in that I knew that his eye was probably at 5'3", and he knew what he was doing to reveal the secret of the lake through this beautiful house. I think those are the sorts of things that emerge in a place like Crabtree Farm, and they're not accidental. And Adler should have taken full credit for it. This is one of the epicenters of my gardening life. This is Neville Bryan's vegetable garden. And I have her patience and her kindness to thank for showing me what it is to be a real gardener. Not a garden owner, but a real gardener with hands in the soil. Winter clothes. This is the view from up at the front of the farm. Down through the years, Tom has done some wonderful research to show that Jens Jensen had done a couple of very early sketches for portions of the farm that is right up against Sheridan Road, and it's wonderful to remark how the ponds that you see from Sheridan Road were actually excavated by Mr. Blair's chauffeur at one point, and we were caught up in a notion that we should create a source of water for these ponds, and I designed this well of water that cascades down into the South Pond. Good design is about a big idea, and one of the things that's so remarkable about Crabtree Farm is you don't need to stray too far from understanding what the big idea is, and that horizon line of Lake Michigan is certainly the big idea in all of what happens on the farm from my own feeling. I've always loved T.S. Eliot's photograph of this part of the farm. I remember being out in the garden with John Bryan one day, and we were walking through the woodland, and there were a couple of trees that had gone down here and there, and all of a sudden there was a slit right through a piece of the woodland that, if opened up, we could make the connection between the buildings near the greenhouse and carry that connection on to the buildings of the farm in the distance. And so within hours, these trees were cleared to make that connection. As I said, the garden is really defined by the passion that John Bryan had for his collections, his art collections, and his collections of garden ornament that are rarely equaled in this country. This is my favorite sculpture of Mercury, a John Cheer sculpture from the 18th century. Here's that star of the show, that horizon line. And a bench that was put there by Mr. Bryan, and I think the placement is an epic understanding of a bench that calls one to go and sit and enjoy that view. This is the walled garden that was under construction when I first came to the farm in the early 90s. Another beautiful piece of garden ornament, 17th century lead cistern. And the cascade that I just described a minute ago to you. One more pathway through the woods. And the Jefferson Pavilion, which you can imagine spoke to me quite strongly. The garden at Crabtree Farm, there's another comment that comes, or thought that comes to mind, and that is, gardening is not for the faint-hearted. Over the last 8 years, we have witnessed an extraordinary decline in the overstory of the farm and the woodland garden. And it started rather slowly and has accelerated to an almost unimaginable degree, where the entire atmosphere of the garden is being altered by the disappearance of the canopy of the oak and maple canopy. It is no question in my mind, and certainly supported by a scientist from the Morton Arboretum, that this is a result of our perhaps changing climate, and the notion that these extraordinary rain events happen in the spring and flood the fields and flood the woodland. The trees' roots react to it by rotting, by that standing water. This clay glacial soil that these trees stand in have nothing to hold on to throughout the dry months of the summer, and all of a sudden you start to see this extraordinary decline, and it is an eye-opening situation that we're dealing with. Luckily, Crabtree Farm has John Bryan III to pick up the chain and see this beautiful place through to the next generation. And I'm fortunate to be part of that process. About 13 years ago, I was called by John and Stephanie Harris, who have purchased a house that many of you will know, just off of Green Bay Road, a house called Clinola, which was built in 1911 by Howard Van Dorn Shaw. It occupies about 4 or 5 acres, as I remember, with a wonderful view over towards the open lands reserve. And it's a great Shaw house that has a little bit of I look at his architecture and I think Shaw wasn't at all afraid to put a little twist in when he wanted to put a window in a symmetrical facade. It is very representative of a house that as it was built in a certain time, I should say, you can see the way these houses were built and the way they developed through time when, to put it in not such a delicate way, when injections of cash were put into these houses and properties. The house is built in 1911. By the time the Harrises bought the house in 2009, there still wasn't a back terrace on the west side of the house. And it's really interesting. I look at many examples through Lake Forest, Lake Bluff, out east, where the houses are they get to a certain point and people say, oh my goodness, I've spent enough money building this house and I just don't have any money left for the landscape. And this was a really interesting example to me that had stayed that way for many years. However, the house was in the Donnelly family for many, many generations and lovingly cared for. And certainly Mrs. Chandler's love of gardening shone through even to that point when John and Stephanie purchased the house. The plan is a simple plan with a couple of things that we had to try to accomplish by adding a swimming pool to the property. The western part of the property is on the top of this image. Originally in 1911, it was a double driveway that led to a central courtyard. It had been changed dramatically in the last, I would say, probably since the 1950s, and the single driveway had been put in place. We reestablished a new courtyard and worked on the garden space to the left of the main house, which was a wonderful garden that was designed in 1927 by the great Ferruccio Vitale. I was so pleased when John and Stephanie decided to restore it to its original state. So we added a terrace on the west side of the house, and then had the great challenge of trying to site a swimming pool, which I insisted on keeping out of the main view. And once again, a house with a big idea, and the big idea is this view to the west, or as I like to say, to much of the Louisiana Purchase. This is Vitale's room that I renovated in the soon after the Harrises bought the house. Wonderful, whimsical trellis work that he designed. And this is the flower garden that I designed for John and Stephanie, with mostly herbaceous plants with some fruit trees and surrounded by a hornbeam hedge, which up until about 10 years ago I think was a hedge that really was underused in this part of the world. The swimming pool, as I said, tucked off to the side of that great view. There's a wonderful quote of Russell Page's when he talks about the importance of having a big idea in a composition. And it's if you're going to create a lawn, do everything that you can to emphasize the lawnness of the lawn. Don't let anything detract from the big idea. The view to Kansas. We put quite a large terrace on the west side of the house, and it was my fear that the amount of paving would be overwhelming, and so I hollowed out at the center of the parterre, and the center of the terrace, and created this boxwood parterre, hopefully with no distraction. The swimming pool is in the far distant left, and the flower garden is on the right. I was very fortunate enough to work on a project in Winnetka several years ago, and this is a project for King and Karen Harris. This is off of Woodley Road, and it's a small probably just over an acre. Lovely house with some Georgian thoughts. My idea was to create a series of vignettes from every window in the house, and to also use a pathway that allowed one to experience the perimeter of this property, and also to make it feel as though the Harrises weren't living in the suburbs of Chicago. And that is something that I'm often presented with, and my response to it is often the same. I feel as though I do a lot to encapsulate people's properties and make them seem as though they're protected or contained. It's very uncommon to have the joy of the borrowed landscape beyond, which we didn't have here at all. But I was influenced by an old garden in Virginia, actually. When I was thinking about this plan the other day, you can see that wiggly pathway that goes through the left-hand side of this photograph, and it connects back to the great lawn. And there was a garden from the early 18th century in Virginia called Gunston Hall, and they referred to a similar pathway as a pathway in the wilderness. And so this was my nod to a pathway in the wilderness. These are the parterres and the view from the various windows in the main residence. For me in this garden, it was an opportunity to use a small piece of property and try to establish this notion of discovery and going from place to place and what that experience unlocks. It's something I talk about ad nauseum. And here is the wilderness path in Winnetka, with a view back to the main house. The lawn that you see there, talk about the longness of the lawn. There was a hideous kidney-shaped swimming pool in the middle of that lawn. And I went to Karen and King and said, I think you've got to take that out for your health. You've got to remove that. And they did. And now it serves as a great dry well that we hope collects the water when the city of Winnetka, town of Winnetka floods. This is a garden beautifully maintained by my friend Phil Rossborough and his crew, and installed by my dear old friend, late friend, Mike Breen, who was one of my great compatriots down through the years. A great nurseryman, a great plantsman, and this is a garden that never would have happened without his kindness and generosity of spirit. Your path is making its way to Greenwich, Connecticut, and a garden that I have been working on for 27 years. This is a garden that was started, I believe, sometime in the late 90s, I guess. 6 acres of New England landscape with a pretty little Georgian Revival house on top of the ridge. The owner is a man by the name of Fred Landman, and Fred retired at the age of 55. And luckily for me, he decided that he wanted to make a garden for the rest of his life. And I've heard it once said about the real estate business that if your neighbor's property is for sale, you always buy your neighbor's property. So Fred started out with 6 acres, and now he has 13 acres. I've had a deep and lasting friendship with Mr. Landman, and he is a person that I could go to and say, Fred, there's something that you should see, and it's outside of Venice, It's a garden called Val San Sibio, and you must go there and have a look at it because it has something to do with what we're trying to solve in your garden. Sure enough, Fred gets on the plane and goes. And sometimes I go with him. Well, he came back from his trip to Val San Sibio and he said, listen, I know what we need to do now. We've got this new piece of property, we've added onto it, and we have to create a rabbit island. Well, in the garden at Val San Sibio is this island of water. It's in the middle of a beautiful boxwood maze, and he came back and he just said, well, the rabbit island it is. Well, we were talking about it with a mason who was going to build the rabbit island, who was originally from Naples. And he said, Mr. Landman, I'm not so sure this is a good idea. Those rabbits, they're kind of dirty. And you know what they do, and they kill one another. So you're going to have an island full of dead rabbits. And I don't think you want that. So we built a Chinese pavilion in Charlottesville and drove it up the highway and put it in the middle of this body of water that also used to be a unfortunate kidney-shaped swimming pool from the 1950s. So you can see this plan here is a plan of the original 6 acres. My time at PepsiCo was about the golden path which connected this entire landscape and brought you back to the corporate headquarters. In this case, it was the main house and using the pathway to make its way on either side of the ridge and finally connect back to the main house. That was the big idea. And that idea lasted for about 3 years until Mr. Landman decided to buy his neighbor's property. Here's the golden path. Fred, you've got to go to Rousham, to this wonderful garden in Oxfordshire. One of William Kent's great masterpieces. The stonework is fantastic, and their grottos and these beautiful rills of water. It's one of the greatest works in the history of landscape design. You have to go and see it. Fred comes back and says, "Listen, I think we need a grotto." Well, there's this beautiful piece of rock, this wonderful outcropping that is part of the ridge that forms the spine of the property, and I've, loving rocks, thought it might be a great backdrop for Mr. Landman's grotto. This is a photograph. Historic precedent obviously has always been an important part of my view of the world, and I call this the rill of all rills that is part of the garden at Rousham and has been a great influence on me for many years. This is an aerial shot of Fred Landman's garden. This is what happens when you start buying up your neighbor's property and you've retired at the age of 55. You can see on the lower right-hand side is the view of the Chinese pavilion that I just showed you, and my great challenge was the main house is on the bottom of the screen, and then Fred built another house that he calls the barn, which is a house for entertaining, and my challenge was to figure out what to do with the in-betweens, and we created these garden spaces that are threaded together with these linear pathways. And I enjoy this photograph because I've always been fascinated by the stuff that happens in between. Fred's wife is a wonderful chef. Had spent 12 years cooking with Alice Waters out at Chez Panisse in Berkeley. So the reason for a vegetable garden was her fascination with food that comes out of the ground and goes straight to the table. And this was a piece of the garden that was done in the second phase of the entire process. I wanted to make sure that this garden was beautiful in the wintertime, so I insisted on making sure that the parterres were lined by boxwood, and the head gardener, whom you'll see in a second, did everything he possibly could to take those boxwood out. He was so tired of hopping over those boxwood to tend that garden. Once again, everybody needs a gourd arbor. I don't see how we get by without having a gourd arbor. There's Alan Gorkin, one of the most talented horticulturists I've ever known in my life. I like to say that Alan has forgotten the names of more plants than I have ever known. I've never been accused of reinventing the wheel. I designed this wisteria arbor at the end of one of the axes through one of the rooms. It was based on a garden moment of a garden that Edwin Lutyens did in Somerset, England, at Hestercombe. And he terminated these axes with these wonderful covered archways, or covered apses. And this was the precedent for what I designed here. No one ever plants wisteria and gets it to bloom like this for 3 years. So I like to say that Fred is living clean. Well, we're going to Virginia. Waverley Farm is a house that was built in the Piedmont of Virginia, near Orange, Virginia, 6 minutes away from the front door of James Madison's house at Montpelier. The house was built in 1847, just years before, of course, the time of Northern aggression. And it's a house that's 75 feet long and 18 feet wide, and the light pours through the windows. In the early 1920s, William DuPont purchased Montpelier, Madison's house, and all his relatives and friends decided that they needed houses in Virginia. So they all came down to this area and bought houses along the various country roads nearby their relative's house, to the point where one of the roads is now referred to as DuPont Alley. This house was purchased in 1985 by Teddy and Charlotte Teakin, both from Chicago. It sits at the center of about 900 acres. There's Charlotte in the spring. I met Charlotte 21 years ago. I was working on another garden in Orange, and she asked me to come by and look at her garden. She and Teddy had been working for 5 years and trying to clear the garden of the poison ivy and the wisteria that had come up and taken over the old boxwood garden. And she asked me if I'd come by to have a chat with her about what might happen or what could happen to this beautiful old Virginia boxwood garden. I pulled up to the front drive court, and I came around the front of the house, and I met her, and she was there with her 2 black labs. And she said, "I'd like to show you the garden. I think it's a very special garden. It has a great feeling, and I don't want to lose that feeling, Charles. In fact, I really don't like all this fussy little boxwood." And I said, "Well, I may be known for doing that sort of thing." This is a view of the garden from about 1930. The garden is 1,000 feet long and 300 feet wide. This is the old portion of the garden. It's thought that Mrs. Andrews, the DuPont relative, went to her cousin's house and grabbed sprigs of boxwood that were 6 or 8 inches tall and put them in the ground. And this is the legacy that we live with each day. This is a photograph on the right from just a year ago. So Charlotte and I have spent the last 20-some years refurnishing the rooms and expanding the garden slightly. It's rather interesting in that it's an inward-looking garden, even though it sits in the Piedmont with the wonderful Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance. You don't have a great sense of the Blue Ridge because this garden is very inward-looking. And one of the things that I wanted to try to do as we worked on it over the years is extend the garden into the surrounding landscape, and you'll see how I tried to accomplish that. This is the peony walk. So many of the peonies were in place from the 1920s. And this is the vegetable garden that we built in 2003. And I'd have to say, and I think Charlotte would agree with me, it's the part of the garden that we spend most of our time and energy in, and it's the part of the garden that brings us most satisfaction, joy. Mercury in the midst of his blue anemones in spring with the Yoshino cherries beyond. This particular garden room used to be occupied by an old quince bush that we brought the backhoe in and tore it out, and no one thought it would live, but it sure did. Another view of the garden here. At some point in my career, everybody got a serpentine hedge. And it was my way of trying to, once again, connect this garden up this hill. At the top of that serpentine form, it's the most wonderful views of the surrounding landscape. And I tried to do this as a way to thread the garden back into the surrounding Virginia countryside. There's a great limestone column at the top of that serpentine, and Charlotte and I have made it known to everybody that there's a column with a lead urn on the top. Charlotte and I have made it known to everybody that we would like to have our ashes placed in that urn at some point. Not yet. But the man that's worked for Charlotte for 35 years was rather skeptical of this, and I think didn't really want any part of it. The urn arrived, and the lid was open. You could just take the lid off, and with no seal on it, and so Arthur, our wonderful caretaker, took the urn, got the urn up to the top of the column, and you could tell that there was water that was collecting in the urn as this process was going on. And Charlotte said, "Well, Arthur, what are you going to do? We're supposed to put our ashes in there. That's just not going to work very well." Arthur turned to Charlotte and said, "Mrs. Teakin, for as many times as you spend in that swimming pool out there, you're going to be just fine in that urn." A couple of times in a couple of years in a row, there was an English professor at the nearby boys' school called Woodbury Forest. And he called me out of the blue one day at the office and said, "Listen, I've got 15 students who want to come, or I want them to come out and start to understand and appreciate the joys of experiencing a place in nature through drawing and sketching." And I thought, what a wonderful idea. This would be great. And I said, "John, please bring them out." So I got very excited about these 15 young men coming by the farm, and we put a crescent-shaped seating arrangement in the front drive circle, and Charlotte plied them with coffee and Coca-Cola and donuts at 8 o'clock in the morning one Saturday morning, and you could just see their heads bobbing back and forth. And I had my 18th century edition of Palladio's 4 Books of Architecture. And then I had I think this was the one that really set them off. I had I had a shovel and a cell phone, and I said, "Boys, what's similar between these two things?" And I said, "They're very good tools." And I had a diagram of Da Vinci's Vitruvian Man, and talk about how all good architecture is related to the human body, and proportion and scale is all part of you if you let it be part of you. And you could just see these heads nodding. And then it was time to go and sketch in the garden. And they all had their sketches. Many of these boys had never sketched anything in their lives, and they went out into the garden and spent an hour. And it was just a joyful thing for me to witness. And it was time to come back to the bus and make their way back to their dormitory. And on the way back, Mr. Amos came over to me and said, "Charles, I need to tell you something. One of the boys just came up to me and said, 'You know, I think Mr. Stick is living the big life.'" And I said, "John, I'll tell you what, this boy is a very smart boy. He's going to go far. He's observant and sensitive. Your kindness in joining me tonight reminds me of the big life. And I thank you all for being here."
So you mentioned earlier on in the presentation on your graduate program and just after how you appreciate a small office. Can you tell us about how many staff you have and how does your office run with that?
I have 3 people who have worked with me for 25 years and a cat. And I never wanted it to be any more than that. I've said so many times to the people for whom I work, I've always wanted to do the fun stuff. And I've been able to do the fun stuff. And I've been able to be with my clients. I knew when I was in graduate school, I tried to work as much as I could for architects when I wasn't in class. And I saw those wonderful waves of architectural firms being blown up when the work was there, and these kids just sort of being downtrodden when the projects left and everybody had to go away. And I just decided very early on that I didn't want that culture surrounding me. So I often refer to my office as being, I don't know if you remember the comedy routine, I'm not sure it was very funny, but it was a routine where somebody had a stick up in the air, another stick up in the air, and a plate on top of it. And they went from stick to stick spinning plates. Yeah. Well, I do a lot of plate spinning, but it's fun. Any other questions?
Charles, at the Piedmont property here, we had shown an arbor and a vegetable garden that you walked through and it looked very dynamic. Was that made of carpinus?
It was, yes. You can see it in the bottom of this. This is an early spring photo, and the vegetable garden down here at the bottom. These are, I call them wickets, as in bouquet, and they're covered with carpinus vegetables, European hornbeam. Once again, a plant that I've really grown to love and use quite often. And in the same idea of me never reinventing the wheel, this is a direct reference to a garden in central France called Flourishing, which is one of the great gardens in Europe from my standpoint. And they use the hornbeam to create these rhythmical passages from one garden room to the next. That idea came home and it ended up in Virginia. Thank you so much.